Principles of Macroeconomics, Chapter 20, International Trade, Professor Wagner. Themes that we're going to discuss in this particular chapter are about absolute and comparative advantages, what happens when a country has absolute advantage in all goods, inter-industry trade between similar economies, and the benefits of reducing barriers to international trade. While iPhone is readily recognized as an Apple product, a lot of the component costs actually is made by a rival phone maker, but it's basically Samsung. But Samsung is really kind of an overall, conglomerate technology company, so they're involved in a lot of aspects of technological innovation and manufacturing. In international trade, often conflicts like this will country will just go ahead and focus on what it does best. So if Taiwan happens to be, let's say, one of the better chip manufacturers because they can do it cheaply and better than, let's say, many of the competitors, people will be absolutely content to buy their chips to become part of the components of their, let's say, larger device. That really requires lots of different components to create, such as a smartphone. Okay, a couple definitions, probably on the test. Absolute is one country can use fewer resources to produce a good than another country, and when a country is more productive as compared to another country. So just simply, what we call, financial and productive muscle. Comparative advantage is when a country can produce a good at a lower cost in terms of other goods. So basically, some countries might be focused on the production of rice. That's what they do well, as opposed to printing microchips. The familiar term, PPP, production possibilities, frontiers before trade. And so we have a couple of graphs. On graph A, we're talking about producing 100 barrels of oil at a maximum and zero corn. And really, that's probably a pretty accurate graph. I don't picture Saudi Arabia bothering to produce any kind of corn whatsoever, or 25 bushels of corn and zero oil, as compared to the United States. So basically, these are the two extremes, A, B, and then there's something in the middle. However, in the case of Saudi Arabia, this is probably really true, where we will probably produce 50 barrels of oil. If we do, go all out for oil production as opposed to 100 bushels of corn, and then there's some other point here that we could choose as well. All points are impossible to produce given the level of sources and current level of resources and technology. So we also, that picture with oil, I need to mention, is actually changed. We're in the middle of a price war with oil with Russia and Saudi Arabia, and there are certain goals involved in such a price war, namely to try and bankrupt the competition so they go away, so you can turn around and raise the product price to a level that you want it to be. So it is a case of once again, economic tools. This slide goes on further to talk about, combinations on the possibility production for frontiers. So once again, they're saying the extremities are not likely to happen, although I'll make the argument, if you're going to use this example, it's almost clear that all the emphasis of production possibility in Saudi, is definitely going to be oil. So I would say they're at A, and especially right now. We, on the other hand, slightly different. We probably would be some mix down here, basically depending on what advantage we derive from producing one over the other. It's also discussed in terms of opportunity cost and comparative advantage. So the slope possibility, it just talks about opportunity cost of producing oil in terms of corn in that example. So opportunity cost for 1 unit in terms of corn is a quarter bushel, which is really next to nothing. Obviously, the production of oil is a great deal more profitable. Opportunity cost of 1 unit of corn in terms of oil is 4 barrels for a bushel. That's probably one of the reasons they don't even bother irrigating, what's pretty much desert. So they just stick with what they do well, and where the resources are abundant, where it's a little bit more balanced on our side. 1 unit of oil would cost us 2 bushels in terms of corn. And this is even kind of a humorous example all across the board when you think about it. If you go to the gas station and you see the little sign that says, how much ethanol is being added to the benzene component of gas, which is usually about 10%. Guess what that is? That's a corn byproduct used as fuel. So it's basically biofuel. That's an initiative we've had in the States for a considerable amount of time. Whereas in the production of corn in terms of oil, it would take us a half a barrel to produce a bushel of corn. I think that's really neither here nor there. It's really not an incentive or disincentive. We do need a certain amount of corn, but obviously the ethanol argument certainly brings to light the idea that, okay, we need to find a way to prop up the corn growers so they'll keep producing corn, so they buy some to put it in the fuel. And if you ever buy the 85, percent, the 85 octane fuel, there is a great deal more of ethanol involved in the gas benzene mix. So basically the benzene ethanol mix is much more ethanol. It's been known to clog fuel injectors and the like. If you really hate your car, that's the grade of gas you should use. Opportunity cost and comparative advantage continued. So it's basically, once again, coming back to the opportunity cost of producing goods. And so clearly, Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage in oil production. And then really, if you have to say between corn and oil, the United States has a comparative advantage in corn production, just simply because, we can produce plenty of oil, but if they're selling it at $10 a barrel, seems to me it would be a lot smarter to quit pumping our own and fill our reserves with theirs at that price. I'd buy all I could to fill that reserve, strategic reserve, because good chance you won't see that price again for a while. Gains from trade, and so that talks about the PPF and Saudi Arabia. So basically, it's once again the Saudi model. And so if 20 units of oil is exported to the United States in exchange for 20 units of corn, the domestic oil consumption is reduced by 20. This enables Saudi to reach point D, where oil consumption is now 40 barrels and the corn consumption is increased to 30. And since post-trade consumption point D is beyond the PPF, Saudi has gained from trade. A gain from trade is when a country can consume more than it can produce as a result of specialization in trade. So what happens when a country has an absolute advantage in everything? This is typical for high-income countries with well-educated workers, technologically advanced equipment, and the most up-to-date production processes. These countries really pretty much can produce all products with fewer resources than a low-income country. When one country has absolute advantage in all products, trade can still benefit both sides. Now this is because gains from trade come from specializing on one's comparative advantage. So basically, even if a country can do everything, and the United States truly is a country that can do everything because it has all the resources available to produce pretty much anything it wants, whatever quantity it happens to need. But there's a diminishing return to put our efforts in the production of certain products simply because it's much cheaper from a human cost, from a financial cost, and logistics cost to produce somebody, go ahead and buy these goods from somebody else who can do this much better than we can. So just because you can do it all doesn't mean it's a great idea to go ahead and just keep everything in-house. However, that is a prevailing question right now in terms of trade. Trade has been a real sticky issue between the U.S. and China and some other nations, simply because there are some serious imbalances in terms of how goods are tariffed from one country to the next. So that is kind of an economic tool being put in place to try to rebalance things. And then also the advent of the coronavirus has made us realize how much of the stuff we are producing offshore that we're really very dependent on, and we do not have enough ability to produce those goods internally U.S. So my guess is things will be coming back home. Mutually beneficial trade with comparative advantage. So we talk about maybe the U.S. PPF with 40 workers against Mexico with the same. And so these are the production possibility curves, and you see the units at different slopes. So with 40 workers, we could produce either 10,000 shoes and 0 refrigerators, which is kind of absurd, or 40,000 refrigerators and 0 shoes. Well, 40 workers in Mexico could produce 8,000 shoes and 0 refrigerators, or 10,000 refrigerators and 0 shoes. So point A is where basically both countries could start producing and consuming before they trade. So basically these are place markers, that are put in, to action. This is, it's kind of like an equilibrium sort. So point B is where they wind up after trade. And so you can see that it's outside the PPF, and trade has benefited both countries in the sense that because they can't really produce enough of it, if they buy the remaining amount or a significant amount from another trade partner, they can actually realize greater consumption of a good. So point B, both here and here. So in this case, we can we can enjoy more shoes or whatever product from Mexico, and then Mexico could certainly enjoy more goods from the United States on the same score. So that's where trade comes into play as a benefit. So once again, a reiteration. A country has absolute advantage in all goods, but another country can have an absolute disadvantage in all goods. Both countries still could benefit from trade. Trade allows each country to take advantage of the lower opportunity cost and the other country. Gains from international trade on both sides result from pursuing comparative advantage and producing at a lower opportunity cost. So everybody's looking for that symbiosis if trade is free. Comparative advantage goes camping, and so they're going to use I guess it's kind of a comparative advantage example of 6 friends going to camping together. They have a wide range of skills and experiences, but one person has done lots of camping before and is also a great athlete. Okay, so so this particular individual has an absolute advantage in all aspects of camping. Should she do all the work? Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, everybody knows that. If everyone sits around and waits for her to do everything, not only she would be an unhappy camper, but there won't be much output for her group of friends to consume. Everyone will benefit if everyone can figure out an area of competitive advantage, or an area where their productivity disadvantage is least. If campers coordinate their efforts according to comparative advantage, they all can gain. It's a very simplistic but very illustrative example. Intra-industry trade between similar economies. So the theory of comparative advantage suggests trade should happen between countries with large differences in opportunity cost, but roughly half the world trades involve shipping goods between fairly similar high-income economies, the United States, Canada, European Union, Japan, and Mexico, namely because of high-quality goods that they tend to make. And once again, they're looking very closely at the relative opportunity cost of production in their own country as opposed to buying from another. 2 reasons for this is the division of labor leads to learning, innovation, and unique skills, and there's also an economies of scale argument, and that's why a high proportion of trade is intra-industry. Gains from specialization and learning, it's very finely split. There is a value chain that gets split up. Many different stages of producing a good can happen in different geographic regions. So we'll go back to the iPhone production, or let's say smartphone production in general, while the chips come from Taiwan or Singapore or someplace like that. Maybe the circuit boards come from South Korea, and then maybe the final production of certain things like maybe the phone screens or whatnot in the United States. Maybe not an accurate example, but how people take the aggregate and they go ahead and produce, what they produce best in different countries. They bring it all together to come up with the final product. So value chain is how a good is produced in chain in stages, such as I just described. Okay, economies of scale, competition, variety. And so the concept of scale becomes very relevant in international trade because it allows one or two large producers to supply the entire country. Also, international trade provides a way to combine the lower average production costs from another economy of scale and still have competition and variety for customers. So basically you have, let's say if we are talking about appliances, certainly LG and Samsung are very popular brands of appliances. Uh, Samsung from South Korea, LG from Europe. And so they are competitors with Frigidaire, Whirlpool, Maytag, which are typically known as American manufacturers. But one thing for certain, you can almost bet that any of those countries who produce any of these appliances are not necessarily producing all the parts in-house and everything being produced in country. They're buying and selling components from countries that have a comparative advantage and a lower opportunity cost, so they can put out a product that's competitive with, let's say, the local brand. This is a economies of scale example. So you have the quantity of production versus the average cost of production of given product. And so you have product plant S that produces 30 units at $30, and then you have M that can produce 50 units at 20, and then L you can have 150 units at 10, and then V 200 units at 10. So basically, if the product is toasters, clearly plant M can produce more cheaply than plant S because of economy of scales, and you can kind of go. However, the economy of scales, the end output is at 150, so plant V, despite being larger, cannot produce more cheaply than plant L, and that's basically because there's a diminishing return on economy of scale. Tariffs, are taxes on goods. Everybody should know something about this. Has been a hot topic. They're a political tool to protect vested economic, social, and cultural interest. WTO would like to see all barriers to trade to be pretty much knocked down. That's the globalist view. I'm not really a big fan because if everybody's hunky-dory with each other, yeah, that can work. But since there's political competition and everybody's not on the same page and not everybody's a friend, it's a little bit difficult to put this into play without some kind of controls being put in place. Basically, if you talk about American exports to other countries like the EU or China or other places, our goods encounter a lot of stiff barriers in terms of tariffs, prohibitive to selling our goods in their country. They even would put even the amount of goods allowable in the country, so they will only allow us to export a certain amount of some good. However, their expectation is that we buy any and all they can make and sell, and that's not completely the picture, but that's more or less what it is. And so We've decided to go on a series of tariffs to try to bring that back into balance because it is a political tool. It's kind of like, if you want fair, free trade, you need to treat us like you want to be treated. And if that can't happen, well, then I guess there's no point in us really doing very much business anymore. And we have actually suffered from the globalist notion of comparative advantage, where everything, the opportunity costs in producing things in Southeast Asian countries because labor is dirt cheap, hasn't really worked well for us all the time in all senses. So to protect, let's say, things that are relevant to national infrastructure could be looked at in terms of bringing back the production of healthcare equipment, medical and pharma back home because it's essential, and we did not have enough control of it at a time when we actually needed it. It was essential, is one such example. So I believe after this COVID crisis, I think there'll be a thorough relook as to what we will produce in-house as opposed to farming out just for the sake of cheap labor. Benefits of reducing barriers to international trade. Low-income countries will benefit more than a high-income country would. But before dismissing the gains, it's worth remembering there's 2 points. Even a small gain is enough money to deserve attention, since increase is not always a one-time event. It can persist each year in the future. And also the estimates of gains may be on the low side because things aren't exactly measured very well in terms of economics statistics. So, that's basically saying that this can be a bit of a murky thing, tough to measure, but basically some trade is better than none. It's really the bottom line message. This concludes Chapter 20.